Good evening from Rocky Mountain PBS. I'm Cynthia Hessin. This is Colorado State of Mind. Later in the program, we'll talk with Colorado State climatologist and the director of the Water Center at Colorado State University about snowpack and drought and to what extent this week's spring storms have eased the situation, which earlier in the month was labeled Stage 2. First, though, this week's defeat in the U.S. Senate of all four proposed laws on guns, including the one which would have made it federal law to require a background check when firearms are sold via the Internet or at gun shows. That was the measure with the greatest support in polls, anywhere from 86 to 90% of people saying it was reasonable. While the NRA and other gun rights groups celebrated on Wednesday, an angry President Obama called it a pretty shameful day for Washington when the wishes of 90% of the American people can't be translated into Senate action. Joining me now to talk over all of this, Al Lewis, columnist for the Dow Jones Newswires, and Alicia Caldwell, editorial writer at the Denver Post. It probably wasn't a surprise that the two bills went down to defeat, one to limit ammunition capacity, the other on so-called assault weapons. But were you surprised by what happened with expanded background checks?
I wasn't. You know, frankly, I think the National Rifle Association owns Washington, D.C. They were against that. The idea that somebody has to provide their background in order to have a gun is heresy to them. You have to do all kinds of things to operate a motor vehicle. You have to get a license to be a beautician. I mean, there's all kinds of things that require at least some semblance of a background check. And yet, to own a gun, we can't do that in America.
The concern, of course, was a national registry of gun owners that these people were afraid would exist and then allow somebody to come get their guns.
Yeah, and that was a red herring. And senators knew this. They knew very well that that just was not the case. That wasn't even a complicated issue. I mean, what this was crass political pressure. The NRA is very strong. I read a figure today that they spend about $25 million a year on all sorts of political activity. And these were senators who were fearful of not being reelected. There were Democrats in red states or Republicans in, very safe districts. So, it wasn't surprising in that sense. It's still disheartening.
It's awesome what the NRA can bring to bear in terms of political pressure, but certainly the people on the other side tried by bringing some of those families from Newtown to Washington. It was largely due to them that they even brought the measures to the floor, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think there still exists, and it's true, that they did get what was a historic vote in Washington for the first time in 2 decades. They were actually going to discuss a major gun control piece of legislation. But I think this also speaks to, you mentioned earlier that 90% of Americans support universal background checks, and they do. But I think what you saw here was an enthusiasm gap in some ways. I mean, 90% of people think it's a good idea, but they're not grabbing a sign and going out to a corner where, people who don't want any restrictions whatsoever on gun ownership were very motivated.
Now, that isn't, of course, all gun owners. Obviously, if 90% of people in polls say that they would support such a thing. I know you are a gun owner, is that right?
I have a couple of guns. I can't say that I use them very often. Sometimes I go down to the Centennial Gun Club and make sure I still know how to shoot them, point them straight. But I would give these guns up. I don't know why I have them. I mean, you'd say maybe they're for home protection. I think the best gun for home protection isn't an assault rifle, but it's a shotgun. Farmers have known that for centuries. But it just seems to me that most people in America agree there should be some restrictions put on gun ownership. Right now, there are very few. It's even hard to think of one. But the idea.
If you buy from a licensed dealer,
right. But the rhetoric. Anytime you put forth any measure to restrict gun laws, it's always Obama wants to take your guns. Do you know that gun sales are through the roof? Ammunition sales are through the roof. During Obama's first term, when he had absolutely no rhetoric about guns whatsoever in any of his dealings, gun manufacturers were just doing great. And now that he actually is putting forth a plan, they're even doing better. So the more that we see this agitation in Washington, the more guns actually get sold. That's kind of the irony of it. But I don't know. The rhetoric on the right is always disingenuous. It's like, well, they're trying to take your guns away. And that's not what's happening here, and that's why Obama basically
elevator speech, I suppose.
Yeah, he basically called them liars.
This goes to what you're talking about, the rhetoric, to what people are listening to and what they believe. Where is social media with all of this? Did it erupt this week on defeat of the guns, or is it, like you said, Alicia, people who aren't likely to do that?
What I've seen is it's been all over the place. You do tend to, I think with any expression of opinion, you do tend to see the polars. You see people who are very happy and saying rude things, and people who are very upset and saying rude things. That's sort of the nature of opinion. So yeah, I would have to say it's just been across the board, in terms of Twitter and Facebook.
Where does this go next? The president said something about this is just round one, and some of those Newtown families, of course, said that they will be back to fight again. But is it realistic to think this is going to come before the Congress again this year?
I don't think it's going to come up again this year. I don't think it's going to come up anytime soon. They've got a lot of other issues to deal with. And as you said, I mean, there's not a high encouragement factor here. People may feel that they want this done, but they're not swinging signs, and they're not demanding change. And the ones who are the ones who've taken bullets or know somebody who has. And it's really pretty sad that it takes that for somebody to sort of see that we've got a culture in this country where guns just trade freely. I don't know anything else that. I mean, it's amazing to me that they restrict something like marijuana, but yet guns go everywhere.
Cynthia, I think it was the right fight for the president to take on, but I also think that he expended some political capital in doing so. There's, frankly, a window in his second term where he can get something done, and I think it's difficult. This is a very difficult question or legislation to get through Congress. He's got immigration reform that he needs to deal with. There are budget issues. There are a whole slate of other things that if he doesn't turn his attention to some of those, he risks getting nothing done.
We have an economy that is still in the drink after 5 years of an economic collapse. I've been on your show a lot talking about how this was just going to go on and on and on forever.
And you've been so right.
And unfortunately, I have been right. And when we're having these battles over guns, what are we doing for the economy? I mean, and more to the point, tax reform. Not everyone says, oh, we got to have tax reform, and that's another thing everyone's excited about, but not excited enough to actually do anything about.
The point of 3 out of those 4 measures was to try and slow people down who might have criminal intent, to keep them from getting a gun, at least through official channels. But of course, what the right was saying is that none of these things would make any difference in a mass shooting. The ones we have seen, for instance, the Newtown shooter had a bunch of guns at home. He didn't have to go try and buy one. So do you think that had some weight with senators, that it really wouldn't have prevented some of these large-scale tragedies?
Well, I think it's a silly argument, because that's like saying, we shouldn't have to register our cars because a criminal's not going to register his car. In fact, he's just going to go steal a car from somebody else, and he's going to commit a crime with that car. So let's just not register cars. I mean, that's the kind of argument it is. It is ridiculous. Of course, these laws aren't going to stop the next shooter. They're just not. Somebody determined to get a gun and shoot up a crowd is going to do it. But if we have some laws in place, at least we make it a little bit harder, and we certainly make it easier to track when it does happen.
Well, the New York Times recently had an excellent piece about, they looked at who was selling guns on the Internet. And in fact, there are criminals who are selling guns on the Internet. This may not stop, one particular incident of mass violence or another that recently has gotten so much attention. But it could. I think there's a very credible argument to be made that it could cut down on routine gun violence by keeping guns out of the hands of people who have serious criminal backgrounds and mental illness.
Now, as you mentioned, the NRA has a lot of lobbying power and probably had something to do with many of the votes, at least on the Republican side. That's a certain kind of political clout, but there really is not the same amount of clout on the other side. So, I mean, do you see that the midterm elections might be affected by this? Those who voted against the background checks being targeted by gun safety groups?
Well, I think so. Mayor Bloomberg, Michael Bloomberg, had a news conference yesterday in which he said he would, with his vast fortune, support elected officials who supported these measures. He wouldn't go so far as to say that he would lobby against them, but his is not the only operation out there. There's Mayors Against Illegal Guns and some others. I think that's the intent. Whether there is the money and enthusiasm to really make that happen, I'm not sure about that. We'll have to wait and see if that sort of bubbles up.
Al, on a business note, when the Colorado legislature passed some gun control measures a few weeks ago, there were some businesses that deal in firearms, accessories, and guns that said they would leave the state. What have you heard more about that? Is there going to be quite an exodus of businesses from Colorado?
Well, there's going to be some exoduses, right? Obviously, if you're manufacturing firearms, then this is near and dear to you. But I mean, I don't think it's going to be that significant. I think it's going to be more smoke than fire. And frankly, it just, you know, it's like the little kid with the baseball bat, right? I mean, I'm going home. I don't like this rule. I really don't know that should factor into a societal decision that revolves around life or death for some people.
Do you, on the matter of mass shootings, do you think that what Colorado passed can prevent another one of those, another Columbine or Aurora?
It's possible. You know, it's possible. It's hard to really sort of line up all of the potential scenarios and say yes or no. But if it's harder to get a magazine that shoots more than 15 rounds, might that make a difference in some circumstances? It might. Federal legislation on that front certainly would have helped. There is, of course, the issue of the existing number of high-capacity magazines that are out and about in circulation, and you know, unless you have a buyback program or just outright outlaw them, which would be a really hard sell in Congress, you know, I think it's going to be difficult. But I don't think you can game out every single scenario.
I can't think of any other issue where if 90% of the people say something is a good idea, that the Senate would vote against it. So I guess guns are just unique that way as an issue.
There's also the issue of banking. You know, the banking industry is very powerful, and there are a lot of anti-consumer things that get passed in the Senate. You know, they wouldn't even elect, for the longest time, somebody to head the new Consumer Finance Protection Agency, which was there to do nothing but protect the voters who had lost a lot of money in the last financial collapse. So, you know, this goes back to my long-held thesis that we don't really live in a democracy anymore. We live in a culture of large corporations and large groups, special interests, that go to Washington and throw money around, and that's all anybody listens to in Washington.
Well, on that note, thank you very much, Al Lewis and Alicia Caldwell, for your comments tonight. Coming up next, do the snowstorms this week mean that drought can be averted in Colorado? As of April 1st, Denver Water and other municipal providers instituted mandatory restrictions on outside watering for customers around the metro area and into the northern Colorado area. They were citing the low level of reservoirs due to last year's severe drought. Now, more recently, spring snowstorms have brought a lot of moisture to most parts of Colorado, but the providers will stay with their plan, pointing out that drought is unpredictable, and it's better to err on the side of conservation. Let's take a look now at the snowpack summary from the Natural Resources Conservation Service, starting with the average, which you see in orange. What you're looking at there is the amount of water derived from snow from October to September each year, and you can see the peak is in the April and May area. The average is roughly 17, 18 inches. I'll get a correction on that, I'm sure, from my guest. Then in the year 2010, which is the green line, slightly above average snowpack, then came the very wet year in 2011. But by last year, and this is the blue section you see here, it's well below average, the most severe drought in decades in Colorado. And then 2013 snowpack was kind of following that same below average pattern. until April, when it began leveling off. It's not as steep a drop as in 2012, but it is still below average. So let's turn now to our state climatologist, Nolan Doesken, who has studied these data for more than 20 years here in Colorado, and also Dr. Reagan Waskom from Colorado State University's Water Center. And Nolan, as we say, drought isn't predictable year to year, but in the West it is pretty inevitable.
It's with us or near us most of the time, yes.
And just this week, you were at a meeting of the Water Availability Task Force. Was everybody celebrating that we got these spring snowstorms?
There was a lot of happiness compared to the meetings in the previous months, but it's not like we've fully recovered, but it's progress, and that's been really great.
Now, it's true, though, that the part of Colorado that did not get this moisture is the south and southeast.
Mm-hmm. In fact, southern Colorado, this is not their second year of drought like northern Colorado. It's their third year of severe drought. And so these storms that have brought snow to so much of northern Colorado have just brought much smaller amounts down there. And the winds have been howling as well in southern Colorado.
That's not good for the topsoil and so forth. Reagan, you and your office kind of keep track of what's going on with the agricultural economy. What does a third year of drought in southern Colorado mean to those people who have farms and ranches?
It's very significant. Drought has a memory, and so that memory perpetuates from year to year. And so particularly our cow-calf operations that rely on grazing dryland forages, year after year of drought, there's less and less feed out there for their cattle. Their profitability goes down from year to year, and it perpetuates even after the rains return. We'll see it takes a long time to recover their range resources.
So CSU began polling farmers and ranchers earlier in the year to find out how they were coping with this?
We've been trying to understand what are the adaptive mechanisms that farmers use to deal with drought. And so we polled them in 11, 12, and we'll probably follow up again this year. And we see a lot of resiliency out there. That's the good thing. Farmers and ranchers have a lot of tools they can use, but it hurts their profitability. It hurts their ability to stay in business over the long term.
So does that mean that we could start seeing more private farms go out of business or into public farming, not public, but the larger corporate type farming?
So I think what's interesting is 2012, the drought was across the Midwest. So our corn belt, our soybean belt, they were also in drought. And so in Colorado, we benefited from high commodity prices. And what really happened in 2011 and 12 was that high prices for corn and hay and other commodities that we grow were offset. So higher price, even though we didn't produce as much, they still did pretty well. This doesn't help livestock producers, though.
They still face this problem with keeping those animals.
They have to buy feed and hay to basically keep the animals going. So livestock production in particular, I think, has been hit the hardest by the recent droughts.
People in the cities, of course, know when this comes along because of watering restrictions. I was interested to read in the comments section of one of these news stories. People were having this discussion about why don't we always have watering restrictions because we live in this semi-arid place. Are we allowing people to water too much?
Well, when the water was available,
why not?
Why not? and it's having water in a dry climate is a wonderful thing. It's a long part of our history.
Yeah, I would add that it's a renewable resource, right? It snows every winter. We get a new water supply. We have limited storage in Colorado, so we've developed water for cities. They've bought that water, and people who live in the urban environment expect to be able to use that water.
Where are the reservoirs at this point? They did go down very low last year?
Yeah, as we began 2012, the water in reservoirs was really in pretty good shape, especially in northern Colorado, but by the end of last season, we were down about 25% below the long-term average. And going into this season, we're no better off than that. There's been very little winter storage. So moving into this spring, reservoirs across the state are all below the average.
In particular in southern Colorado, Arkansas Basin, Rio
less
Grande
than
Basin.
50% of average in those basins.
In
That's
fact,
right.
capacity is down in the 20-25% of capacity. So we need to put some water in reservoirs in Colorado.
So you're saying then that these storms we've had in the last week or so really have not eased the situation a great deal?
Well, there's been no melting yet, so there's been very little
That's right.
runoff. And this is good. The longer we push and delay the runoff, the more efficient that runoff is likely to be. We don't need it for irrigation yet. It's too cold. So we're going to get a lot of bang for this April precipitation that we've got. But how much reservoir filling will do, that is yet to be determined.
So in Colorado, the snowpack is our biggest reservoir, right? We
right.
like holding it up there, and it serves us very well.
I was amazed. I had to go to Telluride for a different project just last week, and it was practically bare of snow, which is
scary.
Not what I expected in April. Did you say it's too wet to plant in northern Colorado?
So, right, April 15th is usually when we start planting corn in eastern Colorado, and here we are. It's time to go, and we've got snow on the ground. Nobody's complaining, believe me. We'll plant through about the middle of May, so it's a little bit delayed right now, but that's all right. We like having the topsoil moisture for planting.
You, Nolan, have kept this historic data for, as we said, a very long time. How does that inform what will happen next?
Well, we see, number one, that droughts have happened in the past. They'll happen in the future. They seem cyclical, but when you try to use those cycles to predict, you realize, oh, maybe they don't always align that well. But making it through any 10 or 20-year period without a substantial widespread drought is very rare. So it's got to be something you're thinking about and planning for almost all the time.
But we can only, I mean, as you say, we only have a limited storage capacity in Colorado. Is it true that we're the only state that has that all the water runs out of the state?
Well, Hawaii would probably make that claim as
Oh,
well.
okay.
But we are at the headwaters, right? So water runs downhill from Colorado, and that's part of what constrains us, is that 2/3 of the water that's produced in the state of Colorado, somebody downstream in another state thinks it's their water, and we have to let it go.
So when we talk about planning ahead, there have been some strides, I believe, in the last several years of farmers learning how to conserve water more than, since they are the biggest user of water in the state, they're conserving more and then reaping the benefit of that?
Yeah, conservation ag is a little bit different. A city, if they conserve, they can keep water in a reservoir. Ag, they'll typically take their water, but what happens in drought is it's not really conservation as much as efficiency, spreading that water further. Changing their crop mix, putting fields to fallow, being much more efficient and effective in the way that they irrigate. So there's a number of tools they can use, but believe me, it's hard. I mean, they're out there in these kind of situations. These are tough years for farmers, and they're not the years that they buy new pickups and send their kids to college.
And it's not as though they can count on the next year being better.
That's exactly right, but they have to. So farmers borrow a lot of money to farm, and they've got to pay that back every year, and so they have to be resilient to stay in business. And that's a lot of what concerns us when we look at these sort of situations, is how do we keep Colorado's ag industry profitable, resilient, and having some generational equity.
The other thing that we think of when we're talking about snowpack or lack of water is fire danger. Was that addressed at this task force meeting?
Oh, certainly. Having already had 3 major fires this year, one in Larimer County that got a lot of attention. Everybody's keenly interested, and so far this recent precipitation has really dampened things over the northern, almost 2/3 of the state. And the fire danger is still quite high in southern Colorado, but you've got to remember, fire weather is something that changes rapidly, day to day, and even in a wet year, you can be dry enough for wildfires within just about 3 to 7 days of dry, windy weather. So it's early. This isn't the main fire season. The moisture we've had helping, but the main fire season lies yet ahead.
When you have several years in a row of drought, what are the long-term impacts that won't change?
Well, the grazing conditions, if you've already mentioned, that's something that's enhanced by multi-year drought. Reservoir reductions are something that multi-year drought really impacts. groundwater levels, well levels, these are things that multi-year drought really starts to take a big bite out of.
Not to mention wildlife and the ecology. The environment suffers as well. And, you know, they have some resiliency, but it's tough on fish. They need water every day.
And so those of us who live in urban areas should be happy that all we have to do is, you know, restrict our watering to twice a week.
I think Colorado should see itself as all in this together, right? I mean, urban people rely on agriculture for food. Ag relies on cities to buy that. I mean, we're together in this, and I think Colorado's future should think about that.
Nolan, so 2013 is kind of unpredictable at the moment, but can you say anything about 2014?
Well, just looking through the rest of 2013, there's a lot of the year yet ahead. The water use time of year, the summer. Heat, dry winds, things can change for the better or for the worse. Thunderstorms localized. The chances are that things will get better in parts of the state, and the chances are that things will stay as bad as they are or get worse in other parts of the state. That's the nature of summer and fall. Now, come next winter, that's a whole new ball game. We're looking ahead, but we are very uncertain about the next year.
Which is why I suppose that municipal water suppliers are not going to suddenly lift the restrictions because we have one snowstorm.
Right, we have to think for multiple years, and so they need to be conservative, keep supplies up there in the reservoirs, and let's see what happens this summer.
Thank you both very much, and that is Colorado State of Mind for this weekend. You may see the program again online at video.rmpbs.org. And thank you now to Reagan, Waskom and Nolan Doesken for their insights tonight on drought. We will be back next week to talk about what the new proposal on immigration reform means for Colorado. Thank you for tuning in this evening. I'm Cynthia Hessin. Good night.
Tracking and letting us all see together how the climate is fluctuating and changing over time. We keep a close track on the climate as we possibly can. And there's evidence that we're a little bit warmer than we used to be. We know what the projections are based on carbon dioxide. You can't deny that there's more CO2